I don't remember the exact day I stopped believing in coincidence. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no revelation, no single image that cracked everything open. It was gradual, the way rust takes a hull. You notice it first at the edges. Then one morning you press your thumb against what you thought was solid plate and it goes straight through. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the record. What matters is that this document exists, and that you, whoever reads it after me, understand what you are walking into before you walk in. I was an investigator. Still am, technically, though I've stopped counting what that word means in the context of this assignment. For 22 years I worked the orbital platforms, the three great rings that humanity laced around Earth after the Accord of 2030. One gave the station authorities independent jurisdiction. Fraud, theft, corporate espionage, marital surveillance. Unglamorous work. I was good at it because I was patient, because I could sit for 6 hours in a recycled air corridor eating a cold meal from a compression pack and feel nothing particular about it. Some men need noise. Some need movement. I needed only the work and the slow accumulation of fact. I was 51 years old and between cases when the file landed in my queue. Came without a client name attached, which was irregular but not unheard of on the outer ring. The fee was preloaded, 3 months operating costs deposited to my account in a single transfer, no traceable origin. The instruction was a single paragraph. I was to surveil a man and a child residing in Block 12, Sublevel 9er, Ring 3. I was to observe and document. I was to report my findings in written form to a dead drop address. I was not to make contact with the subjects. I was not to interfere. The attached case number was 538. I should have asked more questions. Every investigator who has done this work long enough will tell you there's an instinct that fires when something is wrong, and you learn either to listen to it or to file it under professional detachment and cash the fee. I filed it. I took the tram to Ring 3, which is the oldest and least maintained of the 3 orbital platforms, a place where the recyclers run brown half the time and the corridor lights have been on repair order since before I took my first assignment. The people who live on Ring 3's outer rim are the ones who slipped between the cracks of the post-accord economy. Station workers who aged out of their contracts, refugees from the second Martian withdrawal, people with reasons to prefer that their addresses not appear on any searchable registry. Block 12 was worse than most. I stood at the entrance to Sublevel 9er and looked down a corridor that smelled of standing water and old cooking, and something underneath those smells that I couldn't name then, but have since come to know very well. A low, organic richness, like the inside of an aquarium that hasn't been cleaned in a long time. The door to the unit I'd been sent to observe was number 538. I noted this with mild professional interest and took my post in the service alcove across the hall, where a broken ventilation panel gave me a sight line without exposure. I opened my field log. I noted the time, the environmental conditions, the case number. Standard procedure. The record begins here, I wrote. All that follows is accurate to the best of my ability. I believed that then. The man emerged from the unit at 7:40 station time. He was perhaps 40 years old, though his face had the particular kind of exhaustion that makes age difficult to read. The exhaustion that comes not from too much work, but from too much of one specific, unrelenting kind of thought. He was thin. He wore civilian clothes that had been pressed once and not since. He carried a small bag and a thermos, and he moved with his head slightly down. The walk of a man who has decided the floor is the most reliable thing in his immediate environment. I recorded his physical description. I noted that he checked the corridor in both directions before leaving the unit, not the paranoid scan of someone expecting pursuit, but the habitual check of someone who has been doing it long enough that it has become instinct, like breathing. He did not notice me. The child appeared in the doorway after he left. She was small. I initially estimated 3 years old, though I would revise that estimate many times in the weeks that followed, always downward. She wore a military surplus helmet, the kind salvaged from the old Accord-era rapid response units, far too large for her head, tilted forward so that the brim covered her eyes. She was otherwise dressed in an oversized shirt and nothing else. She stood in the doorway eating from a bowl of something and watching the corridor with an attention that, in an adult, I would have called vigilance. She looked directly at my alcove. I kept still. The ventilation panel was solid. She couldn't see me, but the feeling was there, the specific discomfort of being looked at by something that knows exactly where you are. Then the cargo hauler came. The outer ring runs past 3 shipping lanes, the heavy freight corridors that connect the platform to the orbital elevator and the deep space relay stations. Every 6 hours, a convoy of haulers makes the transit run, and from the outer observation ports, you can watch them move in convoy across the dark, their running lights strung like a slow parade. They're large vessels, bulk freighters of the Corvath class, each one 300 meters from bow to stern, carrying ore or processed goods or the infrastructure components that keep the platforms alive. The child looked up. The corridor has a viewport panel at its end, a long horizontal strip of reinforced polymer through which you can see the shipping lane. A Corvath-class hauler was crossing it at that moment, moving in the slow, steady way those vessels move, running lights blinking their standard interval. The child pointed at it. "Fish," she said. Her voice was flat and certain, the way a child states the name of a thing she knows absolutely, not the way a child guesses. I watched the hauler. For a moment, and I have written this sentence many times and crossed it out and written it again, and I have decided that the only way to put it is plainly and without apology. The hauler's outline shivered. Not a malfunction of the viewport polymer. Not a light artifact. The running lights blurred and the hard geometry of the vessel's hull softened at the edges, and for 3 full seconds by my field watch, it was not a ship. It was the largest living thing I had ever seen. The scale of it was wrong in the way that certain things are wrong in dreams, the wrongness residing not in any single detail, but in the fundamental relationship of the thing to the space it occupied. Scaled, finned, moving through the vacuum with the slow, lateral sweep of something that belonged in deep water, not deep space. The running lights became bioluminescent nodes along a flank the color of hammered bronze. The convoy behind it continued its transit with no visible awareness that anything had changed. Then it was a hauler again. 3 seconds. My field watch is accurate to 1/10 of a second. I checked it twice. The child went back inside and closed the door. I sat in the alcove for 40 minutes without writing anything. I'm not a man given to doubt. This has been, throughout my career, as much liability as asset. I do not second-guess witness accounts that don't fit my theory. I do not dismiss anomaly because anomaly is inconvenient. I record what I observe and I follow the record where it leads. What I had observed was clear, and my record of it was clear. And so I sat for 40 minutes and came to terms with the fact that I had seen it, and then I continued my work. The man returned at 14:30. He was carrying fresh noodles from one of the level's food kiosks. I could smell the broth from my post. He went inside without checking the corridor. That was the first change I noted. I maintained the post for 11 days before I found the letter. It was on the 12th morning that I noticed the door to Unit 538 was ajar. The man had left on his regular schedule. The child had done her usual morning vigil in the doorway, another hauler transit, another calm pronouncement of fish. Though this time I had my filter glass in place and saw only the blurring, the brief suggestion of scale and life, before the hauler resolved back into itself. The child went inside. The door swung 3 centimeters open on its own. I crossed the corridor. I told myself I was checking for a hazard. I told myself a lot of things. I pushed the door open. The unit was not large. It was also not exactly as it had appeared from the corridor, from outside. The door frame suggested a standard residential cell, 20 square meters, the usual layout. Inside, the dimensions were off by enough to produce a low-grade unease, the kind you can't quite locate. The ceiling was perhaps 10 centimeters lower than it should have been. The walls were closer together than the exterior suggested. There was furniture, a table with 2 chairs, both scarred from long use, a sleeping pad rolled in the corner, a tank against the far wall, a large one, the kind used for serious aquaculture, and in the tank, moving with the slow, indifferent circling of something that has been circling for a very long time, was a koi carp, imperial variety, a meter long, perhaps more. Its scales were the color of old copper, and its eye, when it turned my way, held the flat, unreadable quality of something that sees without recognizing. On the table there was a sheaf of paper, printed, not handwritten, the font of someone who had run their text through a terminal. I picked it up. I began to read. What follows is the substance of that document, rendered as accurately as my memory allows, because I subsequently lost the original. I will explain how. The writer identified himself as an investigator. He did not give his name. He described arriving on sub-level 9er, ring 3, with a preloaded case file, a case number, and a set of instructions identical to mine in every particular. He described the man and the child. He described the Corvath haulers turning into something vast and living for 3 seconds at a time. He described his growing uncertainty about the unit's dimensions, the smell in the corridor, the child's helmet. He described how he had maintained his post for 22 days before crossing the corridor one morning when the door was open, and finding, on the table, a sheaf of printed paper left by the investigator who had been there before him. He had read that document and continued his post for another 30 days. Then, gradually, without being able to identify the precise moment when it had happened, he had found himself no longer in the alcove but inside the unit. He described it carefully. He said it was not that he had made a decision to enter and live in the unit. He said it was more that the boundary between observation and participation had dissolved the way edges dissolve in low-gravity environments, not suddenly, but with the slow, inexorable patience of physics. One morning he was in the alcove. Some indeterminate period later he was at the table eating noodles, and the child was in the far corner with her fish tank, and the man he had been assigned to observe was gone, and he could not find in his memory the moment of transition. He had remained in the unit for an unspecified period. He described the child's habits in exhaustive detail, her preference for fish at every meal, her tendency to sit with her back to the tank and stare at the viewport for hours, the way she occasionally looked at him with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite indifference but something in between, something for which he did not have a word. He described the way the unit would, while both of them were absent, undergo a form of gentle decay, surfaces accumulating dust at rates inconsistent with the time elapsed, small objects migrating to positions he didn't remember leaving them in, and then reset, almost imperceptibly, to a version of its earlier state. He had eventually written the document I was now holding. He had left it on the table. He had walked out of the unit and not come back. He did not know what had happened to him after that. He was writing from before the end, not after. The document was sealed by the last line, which read, "I am leaving this here for whoever comes after me. I don't know what she is. I know she's been here longer than the station has. I know the fish are not an accident. I know that she cycles through guardians the way a deep-sea organism cycles through host relationships, not parasitic, not symbiotic in any standard definition, but functional. She needs proximity to something that can observe her. We are the closest category she has found. I am sorry I cannot tell you more. I am sorry I didn't write it down sooner." I put the document back on the table. I looked at the koi in the tank. The koi looked back with its ancient, mineral eye. Then I heard the child's feet on the floor behind me, and I turned, and she was standing in the interior doorway. She must have been in a back room I hadn't noticed, because the unit had a back room now, where it hadn't had one before, and she was wearing her helmet and looking at me with that expression, the one that was not recognition and not indifference. She said, "Late." I had no answer for that. I went back to the alcove. That night I wrote 11 pages of field notes. I wrote until my hand cramped and then I switched hands and kept writing. I described the unit in as much physical detail as I could hold in my memory. I described the predecessor's document in full. I described the koi, the tank, the scale of it, the specific quality of its eye when it looked at me, a quality that was not intelligence in any framework I recognized, but was not absence either. Something between those things. The attention of something very old considering something very new. I wrote about the child's single word. Late was the word she had used. Not greeting, not warning, not accusation. Assessment. The flat, accurate assessment of someone for whom time is not experienced as urgency, and for whom the word late carries no blame because blame requires a framework of deadlines that she does not inhabit. She was stating a fact. I had arrived behind schedule. Behind whose schedule and for what event I could not then say. I can say it now, but I will get there. In the days after finding the first letter, I maintained the post with an altered discipline. Before the letter, my surveillance had been professional, careful, methodical, but oriented around the standard investigator's expectation that the case would eventually resolve into something reportable, something with causes and effects, and a conclusion I could write in the final field report. After the letter, I understood that there was no conclusion in that sense. The case was not the kind of case that ends. The case was the kind of case that continues, and the measure of my success or failure was not whether I solved it, but whether I kept the record alive. This changed how I worked. I became, if anything, more precise. I documented the numbing events in greater detail, not just duration but the specific quality of the altered state, which I discovered varied slightly depending on the vessel named. The haulers became leviathans of the deep, vast, slow, bronze-scaled, moving with the displaced gravity of things built by millions of years of hydrostatic pressure. Smaller vessels resolved into sleeker forms, faster forms, built for the open water column rather than the crushing depths. The maintenance drones became the small, bioluminescent hunters of the midwater zone, their sensor arrays trailing like barbels, their navigation lights pulsing in the rhythms of things that produce their own illumination, because no other illumination reaches them. She was not transforming them. Each time, over many days of observation, I arrived at the same conclusion. She was not doing anything to the vessels. She was perceiving something that was already there at some organizational level below the one I normally accessed, and when she named it aloud, the name acted as a key that briefly unlocked my perception too. Humans have built instruments sensitive enough to detect gravitational waves from collisions 2 billion light-years away. We have built instruments sensitive enough to sequence individual molecules. We have not built an instrument that does what she does when she names a ship, and I have sat in this alcove long enough to know that we are unlikely to build one. What she has is not an instrument. It is a mode of being in the world that does not require instrumentation, because it has never been separate from the world long enough to need one. I filed my reports. I received no responses. I kept writing. On day 27, I found a second anomaly in my equipment. My field camera, a standard surveillance unit, nothing remarkable, showed a photograph in its buffer that I had not taken. The photograph was of the corridor, taken from a position approximately 2 meters from my alcove, facing the alcove directly. The timestamp read 4 days before I had arrived at the post. The image quality matched my camera's specifications exactly. The alcove in the photograph was empty. Beside the alcove, standing in the corridor, was the shadow of a person. Not a person, a shadow, precisely defined. Falling at the angle, shadows fall in ring 3's outer sublevels due to the particular placement of the corridor overhead panels. The shadow of someone standing in the alcove, projected across the floor. No one visible, only the shadow. I added the photograph to my records. I noted its timestamp and the discrepancy. I noted that my camera had been in my equipment bag, sealed, for the period in question. On day 31, it rained inside the corridor. I want to be precise. It was not a pipe failure. I know what pipe failures look like and smell like on the outer ring. The water has a particular chemical signature from the recycling process, and the failure mode is a spray or a drip, not what happened on day 31. What happened on day 31 was that the air in the corridor, for approximately 90 seconds, was supersaturated with moisture in a way that produced the effect of standing in a light rain, droplets forming from nothing, hanging momentarily, falling. The smell was not recycled water. The smell was open ocean. The smell was the deep mid-water layer of an Earth ocean, which I know only from documentary footage, and which I recognized anyway the way you recognize things that are built into the older parts of the nervous system before language and learning get their hands on them. The child stood in her doorway through all 90 seconds of it with her face tilted up and her eyes closed, the way a person stands when they have not felt rain in a long time and are not willing to move until it stops. I was very still. When it ended, she opened her eyes and looked at the viewport, and there was a convoy crossing, smaller vessels, a mixed freight run, and she named 4 of them in sequence, faster than usual, the names running together in a cadence that was almost musical. All 4 held their alternate forms for the full 3 seconds. For 3 seconds, the shipping lane outside Ring 3's outer sublevel was an open ocean, vast and dark and full of living things, and then it was a shipping lane again. I wrote it all down, every second of it. The rain, the smell, the duration, the child's posture, the 4 nomming events, the duration of each, the phoneme clusters of each name as best I could render them. 6 pages of notes for 90 seconds of event. I knew, writing it, that this was the only thing keeping me anchored to my post and not crossing the corridor. The record was the rope. As long as I was writing, I was holding the rope. On day 39, the man stopped checking the corridor when he left. I don't know when exactly it happened because I had not been noting the behavior as closely. It had become routine, and I had let it drift to background observation. But on day 39 I noticed, reviewing my log, that I had no record of him performing the check since day 26. 13 days of departures unrecorded because the behavior had stopped, and I had not noticed the absence. I noted the gap and its implications. A man who stops checking the corridor is a man who has lost track of the distinction between the corridor and the unit, between the observed world and the familiar world. The checking behavior is the trace of someone who still has an outside, who still imagines a corridor with different people in it, a ring with other destinations, a life that interfaces with the unpredictable. When you stop checking, you have stopped needing the interface. I noted this. I made sure I was still checking. On day 44, a station security patrol stopped me in the corridor. 2 officers, standard Ring 3 detail, running their weekly sweep. They asked me what I was doing in the sublevel alcove. I told them I was on a private investigation assignment and showed my licensing credentials. They checked them. They ran my ID. They looked at the alcove and the equipment bag and the open field log. One of them asked how long I had been posted there. I told him since day 1 of the assignment, which was 44 days. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a routine assessment. "Anyone else been through here recently?" he asked. "Not that I've observed," I said. He wrote something on his patrol tablet. "This unit comes up clean," he said, meaning Unit 538. "No registered occupants. Maintenance hasn't been in for about 8 months. Building management says it should be empty." I said, "It isn't." He looked at me. "You want to file a report?" I thought about that. I thought about what a report would say, and what a report would trigger, and what would happen when station security ran a standard habitation check on a unit whose dimensions shifted when you looked at it from certain angles, whose resident child named Corvath-class haulers into Leviathans for 3-second intervals, whose floor had once held an ancient koi scale the size of a palm. "No," I said, "I'll handle it through the case." He nodded and moved on down the corridor. I watched him go. He did not look back at the unit door. He did not look back at me. The sweep continued and went quiet, and I was alone in the corridor again with the smell of deep water and the closed door and the record open in my lap. I filed that exchange in the log too, all of it. That was day 44. The man disappeared on day 50. I noted every physical detail of the unit. I noted the contents of the predecessor's document with as much fidelity as my memory allowed. I noted the child's single statement. I ran timestamps on every entry. I told myself as I wrote that this was the job, that the job was to observe and document, that documentation was the armature around which everything else was organized, and that as long as I was writing, I was still an investigator rather than something else. I believe this was true. I believe this is the only thing that kept me out of the unit. I stayed on my post. The man continued his daily schedule for another 9 days. He bought noodles. He returned at 14:30. He checked the corridor on the way out and didn't on the way back. On the 9th day, he did not return at 14:30. He did not return at 1800. He did not return by the time I ended my observation period for the night and retired to my temporary quarters on the level above. But I am getting ahead of the record. I want to describe what those 9 days were like, because the details matter, and because the details are the thing that distinguished them from ordinary surveillance work even before the man disappeared. On the 2nd day, the child appeared in the doorway not once but 3 times. The first at 7:40 as usual. The second at 1200 exactly. I checked my watch against station time, and they matched to within 2 seconds, which meant she was keeping an internal clock that was more accurate than any I had observed in a child her apparent age. The third time was at 17:15, which corresponded to the evening freight run on the shipping lane. This was a lighter convoy than the morning run, smaller vessels, different configuration, and she named 3 of them in sequence. I recorded the names she used. They were not words I recognized from any language in my working vocabulary. Not nonsense, not approximation, precise phonemes stated with the flat certainty she brought to everything. I recorded them phonetically. I still have those pages. I have shown them to 2 xenolinguists and a computational language specialist, none of whom has offered a useful assessment, though the computational specialist said, after a long silence, that the phoneme clusters bore structural similarity to the scientific nomming conventions used in deep-sea ichthyology, which he acknowledged was probably coincidence, and which I have never believed was coincidence at all. On the 4th day, I made an error in my log. Not a significant one, a timestamp entered in the wrong column, a trivial clerical mistake. I noticed it immediately and corrected it with a single line through and a correction beside it, standard practice. When I reviewed the log that evening, the correction was gone. Not erased, gone, as in. The page showed my original entry and the line through was absent as if I had never made the correction, but the error itself had been fixed. The timestamp was now in the right column, in my handwriting clean. I stared at that page for a long time. Then I wrote, Day 4 note log entry for 7/12 shows apparent spontaneous correction of clerical error. Original error not visible. Correction present and accurate. No explanation available. Nodding for the record. I did not sleep well that night. On the 6th day, the corridor changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would alarm anyone who did not know what the corridor had looked like before. The section of wall to the right of my alcove had been standard composite panel, the gray beige of utility construction, marked in the lower right corner with a maintenance access code. On the morning of the 6th day, the maintenance access code was absent. The wall was still gray beige composite. The code was simply not there. I photographed the wall with my field camera. I compared the photograph to the photograph I had taken on day 1 when establishing my baseline documentation. The code was present in the day 1 photograph and absent in the day 6 photograph. The wall was otherwise identical. No sign of removal, no residue, no damage. I noted this in the log. I noted it carefully, with both photographs referenced and the discrepancy precisely described. On the 7th day, the access code was back. I noted this too. On the 8th day, the man came back from the kiosk carrying not just noodles but a small paper package. The kind the Levels food vendors use for dried protein supplements, which are cheap and calorie-dense and favored by people who are managing expenses carefully. He stood outside his door for a moment before entering, and for the first time in my observation of him, he did not go straight inside. He stood there with his provisions and looked at the corridor, not the habitual two-directional scan he performed on departure, but a long look in one direction only. My direction. My alcove. He could not see me, I was certain of this. The panel was solid. He stood there for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he went inside. I wrote Day 8. Subject exhibited atypical behavior on return, stationary exterior pause approx 20 seconds, directional attention toward observer position. No visual contact possible through barrier. Possible audio cue. Possible environmental indicator I have not identified. No conclusion available. Nodding for the record. In the morning, the unit door was open. There was no one inside. The table was bare. The koi in the tank circled its slow circuit. On the floor beside the tank, in a small pool of water that was already beginning to dry, there was a scale, koi scale, copper and ancient, the size of a man's palm. The child was in the doorway. She looked at me across the corridor. I looked at her. She was eating from her bowl again, with the steady, unconcerned concentration of someone eating, because eating is a regular fact of life and not a matter of particular urgency. Breakfast, she said. She held the bowl toward me. I wrote it down. I want to be precise about the timeline because it matters. By my field log, I maintained my post for 37 more days after the man disappeared. 37 days of corridor observation, of watching hauler transits, of recording the child's daily movements, which were consistent and unhurried and entirely self-sufficient. She ate. She sat with the tank. She stood in the viewport corridor during transit windows and named things. Not just the haulers, I began to notice that she named other things too. A maintenance drone that crossed the corridor at 600 on the 14th day. Beetle, she said, with the same flat certainty, and the drone's chassis flexed for 2 seconds before resolving back to its standard geometry. A deep space relay package moving on the shipping lane. Eel, she said, and for a moment the package trailed something luminous and membranous behind it like a ribbon of living light. She was not making the ships into something else. I want to be clear about that. She was seeing what they were, and when she said the name, the rest of us, those of us built to perceive only a narrow band of the real, were briefly able to see it too. I wrote all of this down, every transit, every nomming, every duration to 1/10 of a second on my field watch. I built a database. I cross-referenced transit schedules against the nomming events and found no correlation. She named what she named when it crossed her sightline, regardless of vessel type or size or origin point. The only criterion appeared to be her attention. On the 40th day, I stopped eating from my compression packs and started eating from the food kiosk at the level entrance. This is relevant because the food kiosk is 4 minutes from the alcove. I was away from my post for between 12 and 15 minutes each meal. I did not consider this significant at the time. I have since considered it significant. On the 51st day, I came back from the food kiosk, and the alcove was occupied. Not by a person. Not exactly. There was a presence in the alcove, a sense of the space being used, of recent habitation, the thermal trace of body warmth that my instruments confirmed had been there within the last 2 hours. On the floor of the alcove there was a compression pack wrapper, empty, the same brand I had been using. My field log was open to a page I had not written on, and on that page, in a hand that was not mine but was somehow familiar in the way your own handwriting is familiar when you see it on a document from many years ago, were 2 sentences. The first sentence, she knows you're here. The second sentence, she has always known you're here. I read the sentences twice. I checked the rest of the log. The rest of the log was mine, my handwriting, my timestamps, my records. Only those 2 sentences on that one page. I checked my instruments. No intruder alarm had tripped. The corridor cameras, which I had positioned to cover my alcove, had a gap in recording from 11:04 to 11:18, which corresponded to the thermal trace window. 14 minutes, the same as my meal break. I closed the log. I looked across the corridor. The child was not in the doorway. The unit door was closed. I thought for a long time about what kind of thing leaves a message for you in your own handwriting. Then I opened the log and wrote, Day 51, post maintained. Field log shows anomalous entry, source unknown. Instruments show thermal trace in alcove 1104-1118, concurrent with my meal break. Camera gap same window. No physical evidence of intruder. The 2 sentences recorded above are not mine. I am nodding them and continuing the record. The record is the job. I underlined that last sentence, not for emphasis to a reader, for myself. Because by that point, I had begun to feel the pull. I don't know how else to describe it. It was not compulsion in any physically coercive sense, no force, no fear, no threat. It was more like the pull of gravity at the outer ring's edge, where the centrifugal effect is strongest and the inner ear starts reporting a down that doesn't match the architectural down. Not overwhelming, just present. A steady, directionless inclination toward the unit door and what was behind it. The warmth of it, because the unit was warm, warmer than the corridor, with that aquarium smell that I had by now catalogued and recorded and grown almost used to. And the child, who was not frightening in any way I could articulate, and yet was the most deeply alien thing I had ever encountered in 51 years of life on 3 orbital rings and 2 planetary surfaces. She was not hostile. She was not a predator. She was something outside the categories. And the thing that was outside the categories looked at me each morning with an expression that was learning, incrementally, to read me as specifically as I was trying in my field log to read her. I held my post. On day 63, I found the second letter. This one was in an envelope taped to the inside of my alcove, behind the ventilation panel I had opened when first taking the post. The tape was old, not antique, but several years old by any reasonable physical assessment. I know what old tape looks and feels like. This tape had been there for years. The envelope had my case number on it, 538, in printed block letters. Inside the envelope was a photograph and a single sheet of paper. The photograph showed my alcove, empty. The corridor outside it, and through the corridor, the closed door of Unit 538. The quality of the image was consistent with the optical sensors used in this section of Ring 3 approximately 8 years prior. I know this because I had worked a case in this section 8 years prior, and filed a calibration report on the sensor quality, which I still had in my archived records. The photograph was, by every physical indicator I could assess, 8 years old. In it, standing in the corridor between my alcove and the unit door, was the child. She was wearing the helmet. She was looking directly at the camera. The sheet of paper read, "You want to know how long she's been here? Longer than the station. Longer than the platform, the orbital infrastructure, the Accord, all of it. She was here when the first construction crews came up from the surface and bolted the first sections of Ring 1 together, and she watched them the way she watches the ships, with that flat attention nomming things, seeing what they were under the shapes they wore. She didn't stop them. She didn't help them. She observed. We don't fully understand what she gets from the proximity. The best theory, and it is a theory built on 60 years of accumulated case files, none of which individually tell the complete story, is that she feeds on the act of being witnessed, not on the witnesses themselves, on witnessing. She is, in some sense we can't articulate, sustained by the presence of something that records and documents and pays careful attention to the real. When the station was empty rock, she grew dormant. When humanity arrived, she woke up. The ships are incidental. They pass through her sightline, and she names them for what they are. This is not an act of will on her part. It is simply perception. The fact that we can briefly see it too, for 2 or 3 seconds, when she names them. That is the most important thing anyone has ever accidentally discovered about the nature of reality, and it has been repeatedly lost because every investigator who makes it into this corridor eventually goes inside and does not come back to write it down. I am writing it down. I am the 6th investigator to have held this post, or the 9th. The files are incomplete. Do not go inside. I stared at the letter for a long time. Then I looked at the photograph again. The child in the corridor, 8 years ago, looking directly at a camera she would have had no way of knowing was operating, looking the way she looked at my alcove each morning. She had known I was coming. She had known 8 years ago. Whatever she was, she moved through time the way she moved through the unit's changing dimensions, not bound by it, not manipulating it deliberately, simply experiencing it differently than anything built by biology or engineering was designed to experience it. I put the photograph and the letter in my field log. I marked them as evidence. I wrote, Day 63, found archived materials in alcove envelope, estimated physical age 8 years. Contents as follows. I transcribed the letter in full. I cataloged the photograph with all the precision I had. Then I sat back and looked at the corridor and thought about being the 6th investigator, or the 9th. I thought about all the files, 60 years of them, incomplete. Men doing exactly what I was doing, sitting in this alcove, watching this door, writing it all down, and then going inside, one by one, until there was a new man in the unit checking the corridor each morning, and a new investigator in the alcove, and the cycle continuing its patient revolution. I thought about what it costs to go inside. The previous letter had said the man who went inside was absorbed, not destroyed, not harmed, just absorbed, the way a drop of water is absorbed by a larger body of water, the individual identity of the drop preserved in some technical chemical sense, while the fact of its being a separate drop ceases to have any practical meaning. I thought about the scale I had found on the floor, koi scale, copper and ancient. I want to describe what the absorption looked like, from the outside, because I watched it happen. On day 112, a man appeared on sub-level 9er. I had not seen him arrive. He was simply there one morning when I came back from the food kiosk, standing in the corridor, looking at the door to Unit 538, with the specific quality of attention that I recognized because I had worn it myself for the first several weeks. He was perhaps 45 years old. He had an equipment bag. He was looking for a place to post. I approached him. He was startled. People on surveillance assignments do not expect to be approached from behind in the corridor they are trying to disappear into. Case 538, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, You too. I showed him my credentials. He showed me his. They were from a different firm, different side of the platform, a man I had never met. His file notation matched mine, preloaded fee, no client name, same single paragraph of instruction, same case number, different post date. I told him what I knew. I told him about the predecessor letters. I told him about the nomming events, the 3-second duration, the dimensions of the unit, the rain in the corridor. I told him about the first investigator's letter and the second letter in the envelope and the photograph 8 years old. I told him about the chain and what happened to the men who stopped writing. He listened without interrupting. He was that kind of man, patient, good with information, the kind of investigator who becomes useful precisely because his instinct when confronted with the impossible is not to argue with it but to record it. I recognize the type because I am the type. How long have you been here? He asked. 112 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then, have you gone inside? No. Why not? I showed him my field log. I showed him all of it from the beginning, day one, the baseline documentation, through the nomming events and the corridor rain and the photographs and the letters. 112 days of it. He leafed through slowly, not reading every word but checking the density of the entries, the consistency of the timestamps, the way the record held together across its length. He handed it back. "You kept writing," he said. "The whole time," I said. He nodded. He set his equipment bag down in the alcove. He opened his own field log, fresh, day 1, and he wrote his first entry. Time, position, conditions. He wrote the case number at the top. I watched him write it and felt something I had not expected to feel. Relief. Not at having company, though there was that. Relief at the sight of another human being beginning a record. The specific human act of opening a blank page and dating it and beginning to describe the world, with no certainty of outcome and no guarantee anyone would ever read it, because the alternative to writing it down is not writing it down, and that alternative has a name now and a consequence. He maintained his post for the remainder of my time there. I do not know what happened to him after I filed this document and left. I hope he kept writing. I believe he did. I believe that a man who opens a log in a corridor like that one, who has been told what the log is for, does not easily stop. But I have also believed things before that turned out to be wrong, and I have written down the moments when I was wrong, and that writing is also in the record, and the record does not edit itself in my favor. I kept my post. On day 81, a patrol drone from station security appeared in the corridor. It was running a routine sweep. Ring 3's outer sublevels have enough irregular activity that security runs weekly sweeps, which I had noted in my log and worked around. The drone came down the corridor doing its usual scan, and the child was in the doorway, and she looked at it and she said, "Lanternfish." The drone's chassis warped. For 3 seconds it became something that produced its own cold light, that moved through the corridor the way living things move through deep water, all trailing filaments and blue-white luminescence. The drone's collision avoidance system, apparently registering the loss of its own defined outline, emitted an alert tone. Then the drone was a drone again, 6 centimeters off its original flight path, its log recording an unspecified sensor anomaly. I wrote down the duration, 3 seconds as always. I had begun to understand something about the 3 seconds. It was not a fixed property of the child's nomming. It was not that she held the name for exactly 3 seconds before releasing it. It was that 3 seconds was the maximum duration human perception could maintain the alternative state before the brain, overwhelmed by the contradiction of what it was experiencing, reasserted the familiar interpretation. The child could hold it indefinitely. We could hold it for 3 seconds. This seemed to me important, though I could not then articulate why. It took me another 12 days to articulate it. The articulation came from my field log. I was reading back through it on the 93rd day, going back to the beginning, as I did periodically, to check for consistency errors, for places where my own narrative might have drifted from the physical record, and I noticed something I had noted and then, apparently, mentally filed and forgotten. On day 11, before I found the first letter, I had recorded a transit event in which the child named one of the Corvath-class haulers. I had recorded the duration as 3 seconds. On day 44, I had recorded another nomming, a deep space relay package, and noted the duration as 3.4 seconds. On day 72, the drone, 3 seconds again. But on day 63, when I had found the old letter and photograph and sat in the alcove reading them, I had not witnessed a nomming event. What I had recorded, without realizing I had done so, was a different kind of entry. I described the photograph in detail, and then I wrote, without explanation, without having intended to write it. For approximately 3 seconds while looking at the photograph, I could not determine whether the child in the image was in the past or whether I was. 3 seconds. The same duration. She had named me. Not a ship, not a drone, me. She had looked at me in the corridor each morning with that learning, patient attention, and at some point, I cannot identify when, and I suspect the identification is not possible, which was probably deliberate. She had seen what I was under the shape I wore, and whatever she had named me was a true name in the sense that all her names were true, and for 3 seconds I had seen dimly from the inside of it what I looked like from outside the categories. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. Then I opened my field log, and I wrote the following in full. She is not a threat. I want to be absolutely clear about this for whoever reads this after me, because the instinct when confronted with something of this scale and age and capability is to reach for the threat framework, and the threat framework is wrong. She is not a predator. She does not want our ships, our stations, our technology, our biology. She is not interested in any of those things except insofar as they produce observers, things that pay careful, sustained attention to the world and record what they find. The ships interest her in the way the ships interest a child who has grown up surrounded by the sea and finds that the shapes of underwater things are cleaner and more honest than the shapes of things in the air. She looks at a hauler and sees the leviathan it resembles at a deep level of physical organization. She says the name. She is not wrong. The hauler is at the level of its most fundamental material description, a structure that moves through a fluid medium using directed propulsion, and so is a fish. She is not transforming anything. She is reading. What she needs from us is this: documentation, the act of writing it down. I don't know the mechanism. I have a theory, which is that she has been here long enough to have watched the development of human language and human record-keeping, and that she learned at some point, perhaps 10,000 years ago, on the surface, before the station, before the accord, before any of it, that a witnessed event is more real, in some physical or metaphysical sense she grasps and we don't, than an unwitnessed one. That a thing written in a log has a different kind of existence than a thing that happened and was forgotten. That the record is not a description of reality but a component of it. And that she, whatever she is, whatever category applies to a being of her age and capability, is sustained by the existence of the record. This is why she needs a guardian, not a protector, a recorder. This is why every investigator eventually goes inside, because the investigators who go inside have stopped writing. They have let the documentation slide, a day here, a day there, rationalizing the gaps, and when you stop writing, when you stop being a recorder, the only remaining function you serve is proximity, and proximity pulls you inside. I have not stopped writing. I want to be clear about this too. I know what it looks like. I know that from the outside, if there is an outside, if anyone ever reads this, it looks like a man who has been sitting in a corridor for 93 days talking himself into a belief system. I know that a reasonable assessment of my psychological state over 93 days of isolated surveillance work would include the possibility of significant drift. I am nodding this possibility, and I am nodding that I have considered it, and I am continuing the record regardless, because the record is the job, and the job is still the thing I know how to do. On day 100, I received a message on my case terminal. It was from the dead drop address I had been filing my reports to. I had by day 100 filed 37 reports, each comprehensive, each time-stamped, each cross-referenced to my field log. The reports described everything I have described here. I had not expected a response. I had not expected the address to resolve to anything at all. The message was 6 words: there are others, they need this. I sent back a query. No reply came. The address went dark. I have not received another communication from whatever agency, organization, or individual funded this case. I don't know what others means, other observers, other beings like her scattered across the platform or the system or beyond, other cases numbered in 500s filed in dead drops on the outer ring. I don't know. What I know is that I am still here. I am in my alcove on day 143. The child stands in her doorway each morning and watches the shipping lanes and names things, and watches me with that patient, incremental attention. The haulers still turn, for 3 seconds at a time, into the vast and ancient shapes she knows them for. The unit still shifts its dimensions slightly when I look at it from certain angles. The smell of deep water is still in the corridor. I am still writing. This is what I want the next investigator to understand. If there is a next investigator, if this document survives and reaches whoever the case will be handed to after me. The threat assessment was wrong from the start. There is no threat. There is a being of incalculable age who has found a way to coexist with the most relentlessly documenting species the planet ever produced, and who has structured that coexistence around the one thing we do that nothing else in the observed universe does to the same degree. We write it down. We have been writing things down since we scratched marks into cave walls, and we have never been able to fully explain why. Why documentation matters so much to us. Why the record feels sacred in a way that lived experience sometimes doesn't. Why a soldier will crawl through fire to retrieve a logbook. She knows why. She knew before we did. She may have had something to do with why we started. I am not saying this as speculation dressed up as evidence. I am saying it as the conclusion of 143 days of careful, time-stamped, cross-referenced observation by a professional investigator who has staked his life, his career, and his grip on what is real on the primacy of the record over the interpretation of the record. I am still in my alcove. I am still on my post. I am writing. The child will stand in the doorway in 11 minutes by my field watch, because she stands there every morning at 7:40 station time. A Corvath-class hauler will cross the shipping lane in approximately 31 minutes on its standard transit schedule. She will look at it and she will name it. For 3 seconds I will see the thing it is under the shape it wears, and it will be enormous and ancient and alive in the cold between the stars, and then it will be a hauler again. I will write down the duration. I will write down the time. I will write down the name she uses, because she uses a name, and the name is real, and the name belongs in the record as surely as the timestamp and the case number. I don't know how long I will be here. I don't know what comes after this assignment, whether it ends or whether ending is even the right category for what happens to an investigator who stays long enough. I know the predecessor's letter said don't go inside, and I am not going inside, and I believe that as long as I am writing I will remain capable of that choice. I know that she is not alone. I know that the case number is not an accident. I know that 60 years of incomplete files means 60 years of investigators who found what I found and either went inside or wrote it down, and the ones who wrote it down, whoever they are, wherever their files ended up, however incomplete the record, are the reason there is still a record at all. The ones who wrote it down are the reason I found the letters. The ones who wrote it down are the reason I knew, on some level below articulation, to keep my hand moving across the page, even on the days when the moving of it seemed to have no purpose. Human beings write things down. We do not know why this matters as much as it does. We do not know why the act of documentation carries the weight it carries, why a man will maintain a log with the same discipline he applies to keeping himself alive, why the record feels like the point when everything else has become uncertain. She knows. She has always known. She has been watching us know it, too, patient and ancient and enormous in a way we can only see for 3 seconds at a time, since before the station, before the surface cities, before the marks in the cave walls. I am still writing. The field watch shows 7:29. 11 minutes. I have enough paper,